You could probably look back at just about any country in history and pinpoint an exact moment where if things had just gone a little differently, they could be a global superpower today. Scandinavia, for instance, is just one of those rare places where they've had multiple chances, and every time it just didn't work out. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they all share a very similar history, but I'd argue they never really had their Roman Empire moment. But they were close. I think they were really close. And I think a lot of people just underestimate how powerful they were in certain centuries. Now I know what you're probably saying, you're probably thinking, Drew, this is stupid. You're being stupid again, and I would agree with you, but you're thinking, you know, they don't really have that much population, they don't really have the greatest land up there, but I would argue that even if that is the case, if they were to challenge someone like the HRE, or competed for territory in the New Worlds, or even like stopped Russia from forming by expanding in a similar way they did, that'd be a pretty big deal. I think they'd be pretty powerful after that. So yeah, this is probably the first thing that came to your mind, and I think a lot of people assume this is like the closest they ever got to greatness. I mean, they almost controlled all of the British Isles, as well as huge chunks of continental Europe. If only they just like held on to that. Things got started when the Vikings pillaged a British monastery, because, you know, why not? It was there, and the boys were just having some fun. But this is really what kicked things off, and for the next 300 years, it would only get worse. But I should probably take this time to mention the Vikings were not one large group of people, all serving under like a massive Scandinavian Viking empire. Even though that sounds cool, they were actually independent smaller kingdoms that often would fight each other just for reasons. It also gets a little bit more complicated because this age in Northern Europe isn't really documented. I mean, most of the info we have on this area was written by their enemies, so could be a little bit biased, I don't know. Maybe there's some fake news in there. But keep in mind, they weren't just raiding, pillaging, and killing. They were also colonizing, which is nicer than those other three. The Vikings were surprisingly big on exploration. Their journeys led them through most of Europe, Africa, parts of Asia, and yes, even North America. Leif Erikson set out from Greenland to find easier access to wood. Fun fact, Greenland was supposedly discovered by his father after he murdered a few people from Iceland and he had to like escape or something like that. But the Vikings ended up building settlements in what they called Vinland. There's also evidence that they regularly came in contact with Native Americans, whether through trade or through war. The Vikings refer to them as uglies, I guess. I don't even know what to say about that. But back in Europe, the North Sea Empire was probably their best chance of maybe controlling the world at the time, at least. Either if this dude didn't die so fast, he died really fast, or even better, if Harold Hardrada was successful in reconquering England. Things would have been different, but when he died, that was kind of the end of the Vikings. It was over after that. Oh, and also the Swedish Vikings were doing fun things in Eastern Europe, but very little is known about that. I just want to throw that out there. Most of the Scandinavian kingdoms were eventually converted to Christianity. They were no longer able to party like they used to, couldn't just go around burning monasteries down. This specific what if scenario still leaves a lot of question marks. It's hard to say if this would have changed enough. I mean, it might have, who knows. They also eventually left North America because supposedly there were too many natives to fight, not enough Vikings, and their settlements were forgotten about for a while. If only they, I don't know, invested more resources or time into this continent, that would have been a fascinating universe, just a Viking new world. Oh, and before we move on, by the end of this age, independent Norway would have to take a back seat to Sweden and Denmark for a while. Unfortunately, this land was just gonna get passed around between the two like a village bicycle. The Kalmar Union was a series of personal unions that formed a couple centuries after the Vikings. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, as well as their colonies, were all united under a single king. Don't forget, this included parts of modern-day Finland, so they were looking pretty thick. And one of the main reasons why they formed this Nordic Avengers was to block German expansion northward into the Baltic region. Problem is, this union would occasionally break up and then kind of get back together. It was a very unstable relationship, and this was usually because the head monarch wanted even more power, but the individual countries resisted. Keep in mind, the individual countries were still separate states. They just kind of followed the monarch for certain policies. Relations between Denmark and Sweden caused several wars, and that caused the end of the Union. And there was only gonna be more wars into the future. Yeah, the Swedes wanted to go out and do their own thing, but the Danes and Norwegians, they were still cool. They still worked through their problems. But time had passed, and at this point, I don't know if the Danes started having feels for their ex again or something. They wanted to bring it all back together. And it was 40 years later, so you know they had something special. It's what was referred to as the Northern 7 Years' War, and it was between Sweden versus Denmark, Norway, and Poland. Kind of one-sided there, I know, but surprisingly the Swedes held on, and the conflict would end in a stalemate. Territories remained the same, but Kalmar Union was officially over. But wait, there's more. The burning hatred between these two couldn't be extinguished. I mean, it's still even kind of lingering to this day. The Kalmar War was declared by the Swedes to finally put an end to Denmark's grip over Nordic lands. You see, both countries' main goal was to control the Baltic Sea. That was like the big thing they all focused on. This was kind of the main reason for like all wars in Northern Europe at this time. The HRE and Poland, Lithuania had depressing navies, so there was kind of a power vacuum here. Though Denmark would go on to somewhat defeat Sweden, this would be their final victory over them for 2 centuries. You know, if Denmark just somehow came off with a victory sooner or earlier, they might have been able to keep their personal union alive. Or if they just found a way to give the monarch even more powers while it was still a thing, that would have worked too. You know, maybe copy the strategy of Poland, Lithuania. It really kind of worked out for them for a while. But regardless, a united Scandinavian nation throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance would have been scary. Their dominance over the North might have changed the landscape of Europe forever. So as I said, the main goal of countries in this region was to control the Baltic Sea. And at this point, Sweden had almost done that. They were a serious superpower, and they posed a pretty big threat to just about all the nations on the continent. Sweden had already beaten Russia a few times in the past, and had proven that they were much better fighters than it might seem. But this Great Northern War would be their biggest challenge yet. It would also be the last of the Northern Wars. There were several of those in the last 200 years. A coalition formed between Russia, Denmark, Poland, Prussia, and even more, all to end this Swedish superpower. And it was a complicated conflict because it went over the course of 21 years, and multiple countries like peaced out and then re-entered the war later. I don't know, it's just a big mess. But in the beginning, Sweden started off strong. They managed to force Denmark, Norway, and Poland out of the war. The problem would, of course, be Russia, as it always is. And this would end up being just another example of a leader underestimating their size and climate. Where have we seen that before? Sweden probably should have listened to their Finnish territory on this one. They know how to beat Russia, but this was 200 years prior to that, so I don't know. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but the Swedes were eventually defeated. This war was the beginning of Russia's rise in the Baltic region, as well as just like a new major player in Europe. As for Sweden, on the other hand, their absolute monarchy would come to an end, along with they would lose all their like overseas territories. Kind of overseas. The Swedes had made several mistakes during this conflict. It's hard to say if like a total victory was even possible. I think their best bet would have been just like a status quo type peace. After their initial victories, maybe just getting out of it would have been best. They could have remained a great power in the north and then possibly sided with like Napoleon a century later. I don't know, maybe both like France and a super Sweden. Maybe they could have defeated Russia. Denmark and Norway ended up siding with the Big Blue Blob, but that wasn't really by choice. So who knows what the Swedish Empire would have done. Now these were just a few times Northern Europe could have maybe united and, I don't know, dominated their continent, but there was also the Swedish-Polish Union. This was a short-lived personal union that lasted for 7 years. It broke apart though because of a civil war, but wow, this thing would have been scary. Then there was New Sweden in modern-day Delaware. This was a colony made up of Swedes, Finns, and some Dutch. The problem was it would later be conquered by the Dutch and incorporated into their new Netherlands territory. This is kind of like a meme. People like to make fun of Sweden for trying this. They didn't really have like a strong enough navy to protect their stuff in America, but what if they did? Like a Swedish 13 colonies, that would have been fun. Finally, there was also the Danish East Indian Company and the Swedish East Indian Company, which combined at their height imported more tea than the British. Unfortunately, that ended during the Napoleonic Wars. All of them, it didn't end well. But this could have made a small difference in a universe dominated by Scandinavia. Sweden is now as neutral as Switzerland, believe it or not. Their last war was also over 200 years ago. Denmark and Norway, on the other hand, yeah, they didn't get so lucky. So each nation here had at least one or more opportunities of maybe changing the world, but it just didn't work out for anyone. Norway is usually mostly credited for the famous Viking invasions. Denmark had a chance to force everyone into their Kalmar Union, and Sweden unfortunately could not keep their empire together after the Great Northern War. But obviously, even if one of these scenarios did work out, it's hard to say what it would have led to. I think, like I said in the beginning, their best bet would probably be to take out Russia early on and then do the same thing, expanding towards Siberia. But at the same time, we're living in a universe with PewDiePie. Maybe the Scandinavians will still one day conquer the world. Bork, bork, bork. Hinga, dinga, durgan. Thanks for watching.
Big thanks to Elphie C, Elijah Senpai, Ruserification, SwissAargau, Maxy G, King Solomon, Ben Moke, Galli, TannerOfNazareth, Furry Cruz, MisterPERKELE, CooterDonkey, Braden Hinkle, Destiny 9000, MegaFatBoi, A Sneaky Gengar, Battle Buddy 1847, James Miller, Mike S is gay, Sleeper 56, Huey Long Dog, and Alfonso M6, Millatime, Double Books, Kaybby, Mymainmanmanny, Nikkinagowa, Patchy 202, Buff, Guatemala.